welcome to Woods and Teeth, a podcast about truth-telling on politics and health. I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today's truth. We're headed in the wrong direction on immunizations, opening the door to the spread of infectious diseases of yesteryear. Immunization rates have declined nationally for kindergartners each year since the 2019-2020 school year. Idaho and West Virginia recently loosened rules on vaccine mandates, and other states are looking to do the same. Meanwhile, 29 states are included in this year's measles outbreak, and the trajectory of federal changes could make this whole situation even worse. Joining us to talk about this and what we can do about it is Susan Lontine, who is the executive director of Immunize Colorado, a nonprofit organization that works to protect Colorado families, schools, and communities from vaccine-preventable diseases. Previously, Susan served for 8 years as a state representative here in Colorado. So let's go. Here's my conversation with Susan Lontine. Susan Lontine, welcome.
Hey, Jake. It's good to see you. I see you like in an official recording studio.
Oh yeah, only the fanciest stuff for us here at Healthier Colorado. Healthier Colorado actually wasn't the first avenue through which we met. That's the story for another day. But we did interact when you were a state legislator and you were the chairperson of the House Health and Insurance Committee. And you presided over what I think can be regarded as the last major change to immunization policy to date in this state, which was a bill in 2020 known as Senate Bill 163 that made it a little harder for parents to get non-medical exemptions for required child immunizations before sending their kids to school. Essentially what it did is require, if it's a non-medical exemption, they have to take an online module so they clearly understand what they're choosing to do. That experience is vivid in my memory, but I'm wondering, what was your experience like with that bill and what did you learn?
Well, it's vivid in mine as well. We were still in the pandemic, so 2020, it was pretty crazy. And I was very concerned about risks of exposure to all the people in the building, which is why I had the committee hearing on a Sunday to limit the number of people. But it sure didn't stop the crowd that we had outside on the east steps right behind our windows that we could all hear during the committee. You know, I don't know that I learned anything new because I knew that vaccine policy was a real hot button issue and it drew the most passionate but small minority of folks. But when you're talking about 1,000 people in the state who are, I hate to say the term anti-vax, but I don't know any other, and they all show up, it feels like everybody's against you. When really we know that that's not the case. It makes doing that work hard.
Yeah, I think you made a good point in describing it as a really vocal minority speaking up that kind of masks broader public opinion. In fact, that year we polled this issue and we re-polled it actually again in December of 2024. Specifically, what we asked is before being able to send their children to schools and childcare centers, parents should be required to have them vaccinated for contagious diseases. Please indicate if you agree or disagree. And so the number from December of 2024 is 72% of voters. That includes 73% of independents and 58% of Republicans think it should be required, but it's not. Why do you think it's so hard to get this policy adopted?
I think it's really difficult for the legislature to do that work when they have a governor who would more likely than not veto that bill. He has told us in no uncertain terms that he opposes mandates. I can't think of any clearer statement of that fact when he came out in positive support of RFK Jr.'s nomination to head HHS.
Which is notable. He's a Democrat, and RFK Jr., I don't know what he is officially these days, but he's part of a Republican administration.
Right.
Yeah.
Going against that, doing all of that work, going against that vocal minority, who, by the way, we worry that they may also be prone to violence because they have threatened violence in the past. It makes people afraid of going out on that limb when they know the governor opposes it and would more likely than not veto it.
Yes, and the governor said that, he believes in the efficacy of vaccines. He vaccinates his own children, which is, his decision, and I think that's great. But his position has been that we shouldn't mandate this, which is up for public debate. Let's take a pin in that because I want to come back around to how we should address what are declining rates of immunization in this state and around the country. And we're seeing the effects of those lowering immunization rates. There's been a well-known outbreak of measles in West Texas, and tragically, 2 children died there. We've also seen recently a small measles outbreak here in Colorado involving both children and adults. And then meanwhile, in April, a study came out of Stanford that really caught my eye. It was published in the Journal of American Medical Association, in case anybody wants to look it up. And it modeled the potential spread of infectious diseases that were once eradicated, including measles. And they found that even at the current low immunization rates, measles might become endemic again within 2 decades. Again, that's just if we just maintain our current levels. With small declines in vaccination rates, that accelerates really quickly. And then they also modeled a scenario in which if we reduce by half the childhood immunization rates, it predicts 51.2 million measles cases over a 25-year period, along with 159,200 deaths. So that's a really long wind-up to this question. How do you think about the avenues of addressing this problem? For example, I just talked about how some people feel, even though they believe in the efficacy of vaccines, they feel that we shouldn't mandate them. So I've been thinking about this issue kind of like how some folks think about climate change. There's kind of 3 avenues. 1, there's working on policy to address the root causes of climate change by limiting climate change causing emissions. 2, there's working on via non-policy routes changing people's behavior so that climate change isn't a cause. And then in the same ways with climate adaptation, given that the climate is changing and there are effects right now, they're working to adapt to those changes. Is that how we should think about immunizations? As in, we should keep working on policy, we should keep trying to persuade people on a mass level, and we should also recognize that despite our work, these rates are going to put people at risk, and we just need to do our best to save and improve as many lives as we can. And what do we emphasize? What do we do?
I think there's 2 things that we could do. I think they're all level playing fields. So one is not more important than the other, I guess is what I mean. One is we need to continue to educate folks on the efficacy and the safety of vaccinations and continue to address misinformation, even as it is coming from our own federal government. So I think that it's very important that we continue to counter any misinformation that's out there with the facts. And, the thing about science, it's an evolving thing. What we know today, we may learn something new that changes where we are in the future. And so some people tend to look at that as a reason not to believe in science because, they got it wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. We saw a lot of that happening with COVID. But I think continuing to educate people is really important. Second is that a lot of folks aren't vaccinated because they don't have access. People who are uninsured or underinsured or have difficulty finding a provider or getting to those clinics during the office hours or any other number of issues. That access is one of the things that keeps people from getting vaccinated. So addressing both of those is really important. And I see the access issue all the time when we go to communities that struggle with access. They're lining up. They want to be vaccinated. We really have a lot of low-hanging fruit to get to those folks and to see that they get the vaccines and immunizations and the care that they need. And it's not just immunizations, it's a variety of care, but we are talking about immunizations today.
Yeah, that's an interesting and I'll say undercovered point. Not a lot of folks out there are talking about access to vaccines. They're understandably talking more about vaccine hesitancy, which is an important issue, but it gives me actually a little hope that by increasing access, we can begin to address the problem without having to change as many minds, even though we should continue to do that as well. You mentioned the federal government, and there's been new developments with immunization policy coming out of the federal government. Just this week, we're recording this on May 22nd. The federal government is changing their recommendations on the COVID vaccine by limiting their recommendation on that vaccine to just older folks and people with chronic illness. And they're not just changing the recommendation, they're requiring that all new vaccines undergo placebo testing first, which might sound very reasonable, but they're including updates to some existing vaccines, including the COVID vaccine, under the definition of new, even if the originals were previously placebo tested in clinical randomized trials. So let's focus just for a second on the COVID recommendation for seniors and chronically ill people only. What will the impact of this shift be on the ground?
I see it as a sneaky backdoor way to reduce vaccine uptake for COVID for those folks 65 and under, because what's happening is that those recommendations are what is used as a basis for payment by insurance. Under the Affordable Care Act, preventative care is covered. If something is not recommended on a schedule, then insurance has every right to say, well, we're not going to pay for that. Yeah, you could get them, even though you're not in the recommended category, but your insurance won't pay for it. And for a lot of folks, that will be a reason why they don't get vaccinated.
The other point that I mentioned in this change is this new potential testing standard for vaccines. There seems to be two main problems here, as far as I can tell. First, for well-researched vaccines like MMR, that's measles, mumps, rubella, which we've had for decades, it makes little sense to retest and potentially delay deployment if there's any updates to the vaccine. And second, because we already know that MMR works, it would be unethical, potentially, to administer a placebo and knowingly put people at risk because we know the vaccine works and we've been doing this for decades. But what do you think?
It's exactly what you say. It's a delaying tactic to prevent new vaccines from coming to the market and updated vaccines, because the point I made on science is we're always learning. So part of learning is making things better than they were. When we're delaying those things to coming to market, we're delaying a better vaccine based on new science. I do think that that's the whole point. Also, when you do have vaccines like flu and COVID that are updated based on what we're seeing, viruses change rapidly, those especially. And so we always have updated vaccines to be able to respond to those rapidly changing viruses. If they're not able to be nimble and quick enough to update that, then we will miss being able to vaccinate against those evolving viruses, which will impact people. So even if you are eligible for getting a COVID vaccine, if the vaccine's not able to be updated in time to match the new evolving virus coming out, then that's a problem.
As a former politician, I have a question for you. Coming out of COVID, I think there's been a recognition that from a public health or political standpoint, some mistakes were made. In fact, we've discussed some of them here on this podcast. People have taken issue with certain mandates and statements, and I think it's caused a hesitancy among politicians for taking on public health issues like this because they sense, correctly or incorrectly, that it's fraught territory. Again, drawing from your previous political experience, if you had a candidate from either party in front of you who was hesitant about taking a bullish position on policy that can increase uptake of immunizations, how do you talk them off a ledge? What would you tell them to take action in the interest of public health?
I'm going to go back to that comment I made about how science is evolving, right? We made the best decisions we could at the time based on what we knew. And as we began, and we knew nothing about COVID, I feel like we were starting from scratch. Based on what we know now, what we've learned now, we would have better recommendations, but we just didn't know back then. So we always have to constantly update based on what we know as best practices. I think you can relate that to a lot of things. I mean, should we have not moved from standard transmissions to automatic because that was new, right? Or should we not do a lot of things that we are constantly learning from and refining and making better because it's not the way we know? Science is always evolving, always learning, and we should always be basing our recommendations based on best available science.
Well said. Susan Lontine, it's been wonderful having you here. Thank you for your time.
Sure. It's good to see you, Jake. We'll have to get together sometime in
Most
person.
certainly. Yeah, I'd love that. If you're listening to this podcast, here's your reminder that we're now also on YouTube. And if you're on YouTube, here's reminding you that you can listen everywhere you get fine podcasts. Just subscribe everywhere. You'll be covered and have an awesome day. Thanks for listening again.